Good morning, everyone. My name is Don DeLuca. I'm the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the police chief in Doral, Florida, down in South Florida. I'm joined today by our executive director and CEO, Vince Tolucci.
Good morning.
And retired police chief of Wellesley, Mass, past president, and now the deputy executive director of IACP, Terrence Cunningham.
Good morning.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. Today is our 8th and final listening tour session. And what we want to do is actually hear from the field. It helps us build the priorities. But I think in order for us to understand why we're here, we'll give a little history of what's happened over the last couple of years. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Terry Cunningham, to kind of walk through what made him start this and where we're going to go in the future.
Great, thanks, Don. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. As Don said, I was the president of IACP 2015, 2016. And first of all, you're more than welcome to move down if you want to sit up front here. And we probably won't go all 90 minutes, I don't think. But just to give you a little bit of history of how we got to where we are with the listening tour. I think sometimes IACP is a big, complex, complicated machine with a lot of moving parts. We've got 30,000 members in 150 countries. And sometimes we at IACP seem to set the priorities for the field rather than the field setting the priorities for IACP. So back in, I think it was May of a year ago, right after the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, Vince and I were on the phone, talking about the shooting and what can IACP do and what our positions are on assault weapons banned, extended magazines. Should we kind of go back and look at our position? We've got a long-standing position going back to 1994 in the original crime bill. So after Vince and I chatted about it, we said, well, maybe we'll do a survey. And time started to drag on a little bit. And then we had the Dallas shootings, then we had the Baton Rouge shootings. That's when Vince and I said, it would really make sense for us to actually get out and hear directly from the field. What is it that keeps the Chiefs up at night? And we decided to embark on an 8-city tour. And we didn't care whether they were IACP members or not. We didn't care whether they were tribal or territorial police, sheriffs, colleges and universities, federal law enforcement. Every city that we went into, we said, look, if we can get 50, 60 of the leaders in this area in one room and ask them 2 questions. The first question is, what's the number one issue facing your agency, and what's the number one issue, do you think, facing policing globally? It was amazing as we traveled around. We heard some real themes. Number one at the time was mental illness, recruitment and retention, homelessness. And then, of course, we kept hearing that everything is being laid at the feet of the police. The police are expected to be everything to all people. Where we used to spend 75% of our time enforcing the laws, and now we spend 75% of our time on social issues. But then we go to a different area, and you'd hear some things that are very specific to that area. As a result of that 8-city tour, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, one of the places we went to was in Detroit, and while we were in Detroit, the folks from Canada actually came down as well, so we had an opportunity to hear from folks from the Ontario Provincial Police, the RCMP, so we got a good idea and a good picture of what's happening in Canada and the Canadian policing world as well. So we took those, and today we actually have some of our staff that's here, and they're going to be taking notes as we hopefully go around the room and ask what's keeping you up at night. There's no attribution. No, it doesn't matter where you're from. If you could tell us who you are and what your jurisdiction is, it'd be great, but there's no attribution for this. So we collected all that information, and then we put it into a document that we actually published last year. If you have an opportunity, it's up on our website, kind of outlines the concerns that we heard from the field. So people say, okay, that's great, what did you do with it? Well, that's really how we shape the future of policing from the IACP standpoint. That's where we get our legislative priorities from. That's where we go back and talk to our staff and say, okay, we need to kind of put more resources into our Institute for Community Police Relations. We need more resources in our grant programming area. Perhaps we should actually, because we heard a lot about recruitment, retention, diversity, how to diversify our police department. One of the things that we've been talking about we haven't done yet, but maybe we should have a separate either section or committee just on HR issues for policing. You hear it all the time from chiefs. Hey, I've got issues, whether it's promoting, demoting, terminating, decertifying officers. So maybe that's an area that we should get into. So that's kind of how we started this. We continued it this year under Don's presidency. Don and I had the opportunity to go around, I think, with 7 other locations, and hear from folks, again, a lot of the same themes. Some of the themes have changed. Now this year, more about opiates, opiate addictions, Narcan, what's the responsibility of the police versus, the health issues. But it's been a very, very interesting experience, I know, for me personally, and I think for the IACP.
Yeah, I think it's been an eye-opener to hear directly.
It has been.
Especially if you remember when we went to Colorado, what we thought would be the big concern, we'd hear about marijuana use. We talked to 60 people and didn't come up till the end of 60th, and they said, hey, that train's left the station. Not a word about it.
And then there was a very tense debate internally between the Colorado chiefs, because some of the chiefs were saying, I'm still clearly opposed to it, and I think we should continue to fight it. And most of the chiefs were saying, forget it. Now how are we just going to manage it? That's what we need to figure on. But we had put together a strong agenda going out to say, okay, we want to talk about terrorism. We want to talk about use of force. Again, we went back to the firearms issue. One of the big issues with the firearms-related piece was you were seeing the open carry, particularly when in Dallas that day when the shooting started to occur. There were people that were out there, protesting, and they've got a rifle on their shoulder and a handgun on their waist. So as we traveled around, and we said, okay, the states that permit open carry, how do you feel about that? As a chief, most were like, it's not that big a deal. We manage it. I mean, I couldn't imagine the chaos, particularly in a situation like Dallas. So, but it was very interesting to hear directly from the field, and the issues that we thought were important weren't quite as important as we thought they were.
And that was predominantly the reason that we decided to do this, because you can't, we talked about a survey, we talked about gathering information in another way, but you can't get the context without seeing the faces, without hearing the intonation, without getting a sense of how important these issues are. And the difficulty is, and again, from an IACP membership perspective, we can't just sit in Alexandria, Virginia and act on everyone's behalf without getting a sense of what's on the member's mind. Now, we're not always right. Let's be clear, and we're not always going to make everybody happy, but that's the difficult part of having an organization of 30,000 individual members from 150 countries around the world. But for our purposes in trying to make sure that the governing body and the executive board is as informed as possible, the staff, which there's about 105 of us, make great strides to make sure that we're getting a sense of what's on the minds of police leaders today, and more importantly, what's on the minds of police leaders tomorrow. Because again, you'll get bombarded with information on a regular basis. You'll get snippets of things, and typically those snippets are the snippets that are going to gather and attract news attention. So one of the reasons we wanted to do this listening tour was to essentially give that context, and it's all about context of why we did what we did, when we did it. The key for us is always top of mind. Number one of our values is members first. This is a membership organization. This is your organization in terms of understanding what your needs are is our primary concern. The other complexity of IACP is a lot of you probably participate in other law enforcement associations or organizations, whether it's national sheriffs, major county sheriffs, major city chiefs, PERF, FOP, NTOA, IACLEA, you can go on and on. But one of the complexities with IACP is we can't take an issue off. There's not an issue that comes down that confronts your respective agencies wherever you are in the world that we're going to say, you know what, we're just going to pass on this one. We're not going to weigh in on this issue. We can't do it because of the plurality of our membership from around the globe. If it's confronting someone in Belmar, New Jersey, about 8 miles away from here, it's probably confronting someone in Folsom, California, or confronting someone in Wellesley, Massachusetts, or Doral, Florida. And more importantly, it's probably impacting someone over in Europe or East Asia or someplace else. So the lessons gleaned from those listening tours, lessons gleaned from the networking opportunities here at the IACP conference, those go to inform policy and operational decisions at the IACP. So that's why we found it really important to continue the listening sessions. The other piece of it is the international aspect is considerable for us. So this year, one of those listening tours was with embassy law enforcement liaisons from around the globe. And they gave us some great feedback in terms of where things are with them and what the issues they're facing and the challenges that they face. So for us, again, we value this time. And if you don't, raise an issue today in this forum and you see one of us walking through the hallway, or you see IACP staff or elected leadership or appointed leadership, just grab them and say, hey, I don't really understand why IACP did X. Or, hey, I really appreciate why IACP did Y, but it's not going to work in my jurisdiction. We're glad to address those sorts of issues.
That's great. I think the other point is important is our international relationships. In traveling, people look to us for guidance. But also we learned quite a bit being on the road from our international partners. And I always think about where they talked about the Boston cloud, how they download information after the Boston bombings. And there's great information out there. So I guess we open it up to the floor and start listening.
Okay. Do you want to call? You want to have start in the back, or do you want to talk about issues?
Hey, let's talk about issues.
Okay. So we can certainly go around the room, and we'd love to hear from everybody here and hear the two issues. Number one issue facing your agency, the number one issue facing policing globally. But I think just before we do that, it would be good for people to hear, number one, what our governance structure of IACP looks like. I think I just turned to Vince to go through that. And then number two, I'd like to talk about a couple of things that have been controversial that IACP have done recently, and kind of explain why and what the background is for that. So, you want to talk about governance first?
Sure. So, membership association. As a membership association, your voice matters. You elect the leadership of IACP based on priorities, positions. That executive board serves as your representatives, in addition to an appointed board of directors of 33 members. So that group matters. That group carries your concerns. That group carries your issues forward. And when something works, please let them know. If something doesn't work, please let them know. Because it's the only way that we as an organization are able to adapt, address your concerns, because you can spend your $150 any way you want. We're glad in the past 3 years that we've seen significant organizational growth from 22,000 members to 30,000 members. But again, it's a good challenge to have. The complexities abound with law enforcement, the complexities abound with our membership, addressing those needs. But the elected and appointed leadership is really important. The committees that you can attend while you're here, the committees that you may be on, they help inform the policy priorities. Individual members can put forth resolutions. So the policy components and the governance structure is really important. My job as the IACP CEO is to take direction from the governing body about the organizational priorities. So the staff's just not doing stuff. It's aligned with organizational needs, organizational drive, organizational missions, and your needs, quite frankly. So from an organizational perspective, the governance structure, the governing body, the executive board makes policy, we implement policy. But you influence that policy based on your leadership. So I can't stress enough, vote on Monday, regardless of who you vote for, because, but be informed on those candidates, because that's going to carry forth. I mean, you two have gone through the elections. The governance piece is very important. We have other elected leadership up in the front row as well. Your voice matters, because as a membership association, we would not exist for the last 124 years without each of you. And so we're less concerned about the last 124 years and more concerned about the next 124 years. So governance is really important.
Well said.
So one of the issues that came up over the last year and a half was the use of force and our consensus use of force policy that IACP worked with actually 17 other organizations and associations on. So if you turn the clock back about a year and a half ago, when PERF, and I'm not saying anything that I wouldn't say to Mr. Wexler himself, I'm a member of PERF also, and I've had these discussions with Chuck. PERF first issued their original PERF 30. And the phone started to ring off the hook. We had members calling us. We had people that weren't members calling us saying, what's IACP's position on this? It looks like they perverted the 21-foot so-called rule. They're talking about holding police officers to a higher standard than the Supreme Court standard of Graham versus Connor. There were a number of issues at it. The shooting at or from moving vehicles, So Vince and I had a conversation, and then we actually brought the FOP into the conversation, their executive director and their president, and said, look, we think that the right thing for the profession is to convene all of the largest associations and organizations, get them into one room, and let's see if we can develop a national consensus use of force policy. At the time, you had the current administration calling for it. You had both the candidates calling for some consensus, use of force policy. There were a number of high-profile use of force cases that were occurring, around the country and around the world. That's the other thing that people have to remember. Although we tend to be very U.S.-centric, we are international. We're an international association, and we always have to remember that. So as we sit at the table and we talk about developing this consensus use of force policy, we have to remember that it's not just for the United States. So we actually pulled together in April of last year these 17 organizations, and we had everybody, major city chiefs, major county sheriffs, colleges and universities, NALI, NAPO,
CALEA.
FOP, CALEA, National Tactical Officers Association. We had everybody at the table. We actually had to limit it. We had folks from the FBI that wanted to come in. We had members of our own board that wanted to be there, and we could only limit it to 2 members of each association, the head elected individual and the head staff person from each one of those associations. And I'll tell you, we started off in the morning. It was so difficult that we couldn't get consensus on what consensus would be. So when you think about all those organizations, trying to figure out a use of force policy and developing a policy through, all those different lenses was really difficult for us. But I think in the end, we worked through a policy that 11 of the 17 organizations agreed on. The 2 biggest points of contention, number 1 was the warning shot piece, and number 2 was the shooting at or from moving vehicles. And what people need to understand is this consensus use of force. We're not saying this is your model policy. You can take it, you can adapt it, you can adopt it, you can amend it, you can do anything you want with it. If you think that warning shots aren't for your agency because you're in a more urban environment and it's just not going to work for you, that's fine. But coming out of that, the final meeting that we had and the discussions that we had and all the emails that went back and forth, there were some great examples of times when police officers had used a warning shot where deadly force would have been authorized, where they had an appropriate backdrop, and where by firing that warning shot, they were able to de-escalate the situation and not have to use deadly force. I'm a firearms instructor. I have been for my whole career. I had problems with it. I had some consternation with it. But when you listen to some of the stories, we said, okay, we're certainly not going to encourage them. We're going to discourage warning shots. But ultimately, if an officer felt like they needed that, that parameter, and they felt that they could de-escalate that situation without having to kill somebody, because we get right to the heart of the problem in use of force. Could you or should you use deadly force? And we decided to include the warning shots in there. Again, highly discouraging them, but allowing for them if necessary. Some of the partners that were at the table said, hey, no, they have to be absolutely prohibited. And then if an officer violates the policy, then they have to explain why they violated it. You can't do that. You can't put an officer in that position where they have to intentionally violate that policy and then come in and explain why they violated it. First of all, it's going to be used against them as evidence in any civil or criminal trial anyway. And then the other piece that was controversial was the shooting at or from moving vehicles. And again, highly, highly discouraged. Get out of the way of the car, do everything that you can so that you don't have to use deadly force. However, as we've seen these events unfolding around the world, not just in Europe and in Germany, and you're starting to see them here in the United States, there has to be the officers have to be allowed to shoot at moving vehicles when appropriate. particularly in these terrorist activities where they're using the vehicle as the weapon itself. So again, our partners, a couple of our partners that were there said, no, absolutely not. It's got to be strictly prohibited, and then when the officer violates that policy, then they have to explain why they violated it. So we disagreed, and we moved forward without, I think, we lost six of the associations or organizations that were involved in it, and ultimately we published the policy just, January, I think, of this year?
Yep.
And we just actually finished the concepts and issues paper, which explains how we got to where we did on all of the issues in the use of force policy. And just last week, and I don't know where it came from or what started it, just last week in Law Officer, they published an article about, and the title of the article was, "The International Association of Chiefs of Police Use of Force Policy Encourages Warning Shots," which then set off a firestorm because people are saying, oh, yeah, you know, line officers are thinking that we're saying you have to fire a warning shot before you can actually use deadly force, and that was not the case. It wasn't our policy. It was a consensus use of force policy. So we actually got the editor on the phone, had some conversations with them, and they actually backtracked, changed the title of the article, and then they actually changed what was written in the article. So if anybody has any questions or concerns about that, I actually see some folks in the room that were at the table when we developed that use of force policy. So happy to answer any of those questions.
Yeah, because that's those 4-second clips you see, and social media drives a lot of this. And to law officers' credit, Travis Yates, I believe it was, Travis got on the phone with us right away and wanted to make sure that whatever was being said in that article was accurate, and they did what they said they were going to do, because it's complicated, and when you all have important, busy jobs. And so when somebody comes in and says, hey, IACP is endorsing warning shots or, you know, recommending warning shots, that raises some red flags. And without having a sort of sit-down opportunity like this to hear sort of the rationale that went into the decision-making, it sends folks aflutter, understandably so. Any questions on the consensus use of force policy? Concerns? Things that you may have heard that you want clarification for why things happened the way they did. The one thing, as Terry mentioned, the discussion paper is going to be released on Monday, the 23rd. We needed to separate out, and typically we don't, we needed to separate out the policy from the discussion paper in this instance because of the urgency of those discussions that were happening in the U.S. by the campaigns, by the administration. The group, and it was a great group to work with, the group moved as quickly as we could with such an important topic. And so that consensus use of force policy was released to make sure folks had a template to work from. And typically that discussion paper would have been released at the same time. Urgency insisted that we couldn't do that. So it took a little bit longer than hoped to connect those two things. So the context behind those pieces that are in the consensus use of force policy will be clearly outlined and discussed in greater detail when the discussion paper is released on Monday.
Any questions?
Use of force, consensus policy. Okay. Next controversial topic.
Well, how about talking about the resolution process?
Yeah, okay.
You want to do that?
Yep. So resolutions. Resolutions are the official policy statements of the organization. And all members have the ability to vote on those resolutions. That voting process happens some time after the conference so people can digest it. It's now online. But they work their way up through a process. So it will go to emanate from a committee. And it'll go to our resolutions committee, it'll go to the board of directors, it'll go to the executive board, but ultimately the membership is the final signature on all resolutions. So the resolutions piece is really important. We had a really in-depth discussion yesterday regarding a couple resolutions that you know, addressed policy issues that came to fore after Las Vegas. So bump stocks, tracer rounds, silencers. So again, the urgency of the situation, because again, things drive other policy changes. The attacks in Berlin with the trucks and in Nice, again, made us rethink and helped inform that discussion on use of force. So same thing goes with Las Vegas. When something arises that needs to be addressed quickly, one of the things we've really focused on, and one of the things that the executive board and the appointed and elected leadership is really focused on, is how do you make an organization of IACP size more and as nimble as possible, given the diversity of issues, the diversity of viewpoints, the diversity of membership. How do you be as nimble as possible? And so that's a classic example of moving as quickly as we can. So when you see your resolutions, there's going to be really important stuff in there that guides the policy. If you disagree with something, say so. If you don't want to support it, vote it no. But those policies are there from an organizational standpoint. And I have to tell you, from trying to go into a policy discussion, whether it's in this country or another, there's a good chance that after 124 years, we have a resolution on just about every topic, or we can extrapolate it from that resolution. So never discount the importance of the member voice. And that member voice comes through loud and clear through both, one, the elections, to the resolution process. Because of the fact, if we're not doing something right, let us know. If you think there could be something done differently, let us know. If you know of a gap in your respective community and you've searched that resolutions database and you think it's really important, chances are it may be important to your neighboring jurisdiction, bring it to the fore, take it to a committee, or put it forth as an individual, which is in the IACP Constitution, that you're more than welcome to and capable of doing.
Great. You know, I'd like to take a moment and talk about the violence against police.
Yep.
In 2016, right after Dallas and Baton Rouge, we all saw that ambush killings were on the rise. Soon after becoming president, there were 4 officers and 3 incidents in a 24-hour period, ambush-style killings. We ramped up a task force for violence against the police and got some of the best and brightest to address this. And our goal was to do something in a short term, bring together a group and be able to deliver something at the conference here. I see Rick Smith in the back, and I'm going to ask Rick if he could do me a favor. I asked Rick, our Vice President at Large, to chair this committee and bring something forth that the chiefs can use, and it's a chief's guide. But also there's a couple workshops on Sunday and Monday that if you have a chance to attend, I think it'd be well worth it. You can go back with these materials and make sure you're doing these things to keep your police officers safe. So Rick, if you'd be so kind to talk about the task force and the steps we've taken to date to get to where we are to push this out.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, it was a great honor to be asked by the President to chair this task force. It was so important then, and even more important today as we move forward. But what we did was we brought together a bunch of our partners. We went out and we got a hold of 15 communities, 15 leaders from very large agencies to very small agencies. And the most important piece that we added to this was the community piece. And based on that, we brainstormed a little bit and decided that we needed to get to the chiefs, and the chiefs needed to get to the troops. We had to come up with a product that we'd be able to deliver, which is deliverable at the conference here now, which would, actually, they could take in their patrol cars, you could use it as a teaching element, and it could be used at roll call. So the bottom line is that we were able to put this together in a year's time and let everybody know just exactly why these ambushes were happening, and the best way to prevent and the best way to train our personnel to stay safe and keep tactically aware while at the same time engaging their community. And I think so far, Mr. President, we've had great success, and I think going forward we're going to see great success among our peers here in the theater this morning and at the conference as we go across nationwide. So I'm looking forward to it, and again, as the President said, there are 2 sessions, one Sunday morning at 8 a.m. and one Monday afternoon at 3 p.m., which will articulate exactly what's going on, what we did, and what we hope to accomplish going forward and reduce these assaults and deaths in our line of work.
Thank you, Rick. And I guess it was the FBI just published, you know, there's over 50,000 acts of violence against the police every year, and that's a big number. And a lot of those officers go out on injury, disability, and it really hurts us on the street. But Rick, thank you for taking on this challenge. Let's start. Anybody want to grab a mic and tell us what's going on, your concern with your agency?
Sorry, I don't normally come to these, but I do. I mean, I come to the IACP, I just don't come to a lot of these. But the consensus policy, I'm sorry, I'm Mike Cochran. I'm a Chief Deputy Berkeley County, South Carolina, retired from Lauderhill in the center of Broward, so you know where I'm coming from. And I came from a really incredibly diverse environment, and I work in an area that's not quite as diverse, but still a very nice area. Lauderhill, as you know, 78% non-white, Jamaican, Haitian, Trinidadian, very diverse. We policed, and we did it well. Last year, when I went to IACP, and maybe this has been discussed because I came in 4 minutes late, I was on the wrong side of the 100. But the issue, and it was your statements that I was so offended by those statements. I mean, I've worked my entire career to serve and protect, and we honestly serve and protect, and we don't historically mistreat people, never have. In the county where I'm at now, 3 times this year, we've chased cars till they crashed. 3 times they've caught, and 2 of them they caught on fire. Our deputies put the fire out and rescued the people. And they're not always the same demographic qualities. So the thing is we do the right thing all day, every day. And so as an agency as large as the IACP, I know it's international, when it comes to these model policies and things, if you're pushing them out as the model policy, the George Alberts, the academic types are going to judge us against that model policy, even though we're not in those areas of the country. You know what I'm saying? And so what works in Berkeley County, South Carolina is 1,229 square miles, 214,000 people. What works in Berkeley may not work in Lowell or these other places of the country. And so if it's something that's so divisive, or it's these things that are going to be impactful, they're lightning rod topics, I'd be much more comfortable if they say, you know what, it's way too diverse of a country for us to give a policy or a recommendation on warning shots or use of force or pursuits. Because all that stuff, to me, under the last several years, it got very, very politicized, being drawn into this policing in 21st century and all that kind of stuff. You know, I have a terminal degree. I've been to all the good schools. I understand all that stuff. I don't necessarily buy whatever the presidential administration is pushing at that particular moment, because long after they're gone, we'll still be here. And long after they're gone, you know, the community, when they need something, if you look at the Gallup polls, it's a longitudinal study. I've been doing it over 30 years, the confidence in public institutions. 56% of the people trust us or really trust us. 14 or 15% trust the media. Less trust the Congress. We're the people that they trust and protect. And so from the IACP's perspective, I just think that you can't always speak for all of us. Now, granted, you speak for the executive board, but that situation last year, I wrote the lady from California when I left, because it took me about 2 days to not send that email, and I finally sent her an email. She called me and we spoke, because I was just so personally offended. God, in my 27 years, I've never beat on people. I've never mistreated them. I take care of people, and I'm in a community where I was a distinct minority. And so that said, in a global context, I don't know if we're this large and this diverse that everything you can speak on can speak. What works in Doral doesn't work in Moncks Corner, and vice versa. And so sometimes you just got to say, you know what? These are the issues, but like politics are local, policing is local. And sometimes what we do locally, we have to do locally. And so that's it. Not a point. I just wanted to say that and take it as it is, but I've been a member for a long time, so I figured I'd come.
We appreciate your comments, and if Terry would like to take a bite at the first one, because I think the comments itself, when you understand what's behind it, I think it helps clarify the intent. And so, Terry, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I think you conflated a couple of the issues. One was with the use of force policy, and then one was my statements from San Diego last year. So in the use of force policy, I feel like we do have an obligation and a responsibility. And when I just talked about the use of force policy, said it wasn't a model policy, right? Consensus use of force, adapt it, amend it, change it, do whatever you want. Here are the parameters that we put. That's why the concepts and issues paper was so important for us to put out there, so people can understand what the major issues were and take it back to their agencies. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that 80% of the agencies, just in this country alone, the 18,000 agencies out there, are less than 25 officers. So a lot of them just don't have the ability to write their own policies, and they look to IACP to do that for them. Some of the policies we have are our model policies. That one didn't happen to be one of them. I understand your point on you can't be all things to all people, but as Vince said early on, that there aren't a lot of issues in policing that IACP can't talk about or take on or have to respond to. The first comment about my statements in San Diego. So first of all, I made it very clear when I was up there, and if you were actually there and listened to them, or you read the actual statements later, I said I am not talking about contemporary issues in policing. I'm not talking about the Alton Sterling case. I'm not talking about Philando Castile, Michael Brown. I'm not talking about any of those. But if you look through the lens of history, historically, policing, we have mistreated minorities. It's just a fact. I mean, whether it was, enforcing the slave laws, enforcing Jim Crow laws, historically, they have been mistreated by the police. A lot of times, it was as a result of state laws, federal laws, or local laws, and we were put in the position, we the police were put in the position where we had to enforce those laws. When I go to the FBI National Academy and I speak about the IACP all the time, every class is there. And of course, since my statement, a lot of people have come up and said I was offended by it, I didn't like it, and I never mistreated anybody. I said, I didn't say that. I didn't say anybody here did. As a matter of fact, the people in this room here, and I made that statement in San Diego, said everybody in this room here, I'm sure have treated people fairly and justly and with equality. But you know what? When you put that uniform on, you put all that history on with it. It's not just, hey, I never did it, so I shouldn't realize that that's the lens that a lot of people look through. I was talking to Dave Kennedy, who's a professor who does a lot of work on reconciliation. And David said, one of the issues, Terry, is this was last year. He said, when you have a Philando Castile shooting or Michael Brown shooting, particularly as a white police officer or even just a white citizen, right? You look at it like, okay, let's let the investigation unfold. Let's make sure that we've got all the interviews, got all the videotape, got all the biological evidence, all the forensics. We do all that stuff, and then we'll make a determination and see whether or not this case needs to go to court. He said that all makes sense, but when you're an African American, whether you're an African American police officer or just an African American citizen of the United States, you look at it through the lens of history. Completely different, because the people that were mistreated, we're not talking just one generation ago. I mean, it's been within the last 20 years, 25 years, when the last Jim Crow law was actually repealed. And I hate to rehash history, but I think it's appropriate for the audience that we have here. The way I got to where I did when I made those statements in San Diego was right after we had the Dallas shootings. If you back up just before the Dallas shootings happened, it was actually President Obama was traveling overseas, and he made some statements that he actually put up on his Facebook page, which were very critical of law enforcement. And then he made some statements orally when he landed, I think it was in Spain, that were very critical of law enforcement. And then right after that, you had the shooting in Dallas as a result of it. So it was Vince, myself, and a couple of other members of IACP sat in a room. We actually reached out directly to the White House. We got to the folks just below the president, said, we need to have a meeting with the president. This has got to stop, right? His comments matter. What he says matters. I won't take you through all the details of it, but ultimately we got a meeting. That was the shootings happened on Thursday. We had a meeting Monday morning in the White House in the Roosevelt Room. The president was there. The vice president was there. We had 6 of our other partners that were in the room as well. And when I walked in that room, IACP, we had put together a plan going forward. We wanted to talk about culture. We want to talk about leadership. What can we do to help? But in the meantime, the president had to be held accountable for what he had said and what had happened. So when the president first walked into that room, he came in. He spoke for about 20 minutes or so, and then he sat down, and he was 2 seats over from me. He turned to me and he says, I want to start with IACP. Chief, what do you have to say? And I took him through it, and I held him accountable for what he had said. And I said, Mr. President, you said some things publicly where you had the Attorney General of the United States standing in the streets of Ferguson saying that Darren Wilson is going to be indicted. Now, you want to talk about putting your thumb on the scale? That's standing on the scale. And then I said, then you've made some statements publicly, which, quite frankly, were less than supportive of law enforcement. And then he stopped me there. He goes, hey, I got to push back. He says, I disagree with you. He says, I think we need to look at the record. I said, Mr. President, you're a brilliant man. You're a constitutional scholar. And that's exactly what I said to him. I said, I don't think we have to look at the record. And then we had a further discussion, went around the room. I'll tell you, Tom Manger from the Major City Chiefs was there with us. Tom held him accountable to, as far as what he had said and what he had done, as far as lack of support for the police. And when we finished going around the room, the president got up to walk out, and I had a comment that I wanted to make to him, and I said something to him that actually brought him back in the room, and he sat down. And then he and I kind of had a discussion between the two of us with everybody else sitting there. And he started about saying, look, there's never been an acknowledgement on the part of the police that there was any historic mistrust of African Americans. And he said, you can't even start a conversation until you get there. He said, the reason why everybody's in their corners right now is there has to be some acknowledgement that there has been some historical mistreatment of African Americans. Until you get there, you're just not going to have it. So I said, okay, I understood where he was coming from. Wednesday, we had a much larger meeting in the White House. Had, members of the community were there. They had legislators there. And again, we kind of had the same conversation, but this time we had folks from Black Lives Matter in the room, and Al Sharpton was in the room, and some other, activists were in the room. And when I walked out of there, immediately I heard from people, oh, the president was disrespectful to law enforcement. Quite frankly, it was just the opposite. I don't know whether the conversation that we had had on Monday made a difference. I think it did, because he was very supportive of law enforcement in that room, and he pushed back against Black Lives Matter. And I remember him saying to one of the activists, when they started screaming about the police and the police brutality and and why it's happening and how it's happening. And I remember the president saying, I was a demonstrator in the 70s, and he said, at least when we demonstrated for a reason. There was an end to the means. And you people being Black Lives Matter, he says, you don't have any ends to your mean. He says, matter of fact, I invited one of the people who was self-proclaimed like head of the Black Lives Matter movement to the Oval Office to have a discussion to say, what is it that you want? What do you want to get to in the end? And they refused a meeting with the President of the United States because, quote, they said, I'm not going to be co-opted by the president. So we had this discussion on Wednesday. Then on Thursday, it was the memorial service for the Dallas officers that Vince and I went down to. I'm sitting in the front row. Took Vince and I 4 hours to get through security, to get in there. We sat there, we waited. We're in the front row. I look over here, and all the families of the Dallas officers that had been shot were there. Their kids were climbing in the parents' laps. And I'm looking over and thinking how sad this is, and what's the president going to say? President comes out. President Bush was there as well. President Obama gets up on stage, and immediately you could tell he wasn't talking to that audience at all. He was talking to a much bigger audience. He was, talking about Philando Castile and how he looked like Mr. Rogers with dreadlocks, and it was just a complete, anti kind of police rhetoric again from the president. So as we walked out of the memorial service, a reporter from the LA Times grabbed me and said, because I was in uniform and Vince was with me, and the reporter said, what did you think about the president's comments? And I couldn't help myself. I said, we just had this conversation. And that's the other thing she said to me. She said that he had called the family of Philando Castile on his way from D.C. to Dallas. And when we were in the White House on Monday, I had said to him, why is it that you call these other families, but you don't call the families of the police officers when they're killed? And he said, well, I always write them a personal note. He said, and I think that goes a lot further than the telephone call. I said, you know what? There's only 130 officers a year, that are killed in the line of duty. Probably, 50 of them, 60 of them through firearms. You could write them a note and you could call them. You could do both, Mr. President. You could take the time. So now he calls Philando Castile's family on his way to Dallas. So when that reporter grabbed me, I said, you know what? We just had this conversation. I can't tell you how disappointed I am, with the president.
Let me adjust your timeline a little bit to punctuate the awkwardness.
Oh, you're right.
So
You're right. Yep.
Monday was
You're
the
right.
smaller meeting with the president.
Yep.
The funerals and the LA Times interview was on Tuesday.
That's right.
Wednesday was the broader meeting where Terry then sat next to the president at that meeting. Go ahead.
So as I walked into the meeting on Wednesday, one of his staff folks said to me, hey, you're going to be sitting beside the president today. I said, okay. And I'm in uniform. I walk in. You could see the flags. You knew where the president was going to sit. I sit down. And the staff person said to me, oh, he read your your comments in the LA Times. I said, okay. So I sat down. The president comes in, sits down beside me, says hi. He and I, small talk for a second, and then he starts the meeting. As he starts to go around the room, he actually turned to Chuck Ramsey and Laura Robinson, the two co-chairs from the task force first. And then as they start to go around the room, he turns to me, and I said, so you read my comments in the LA Times? He said, yep. I said, are you upset? Are you mad? He says, if I was, you wouldn't be sitting here. I said, okay, fair enough. But it was the president's comments to me on that Monday when he said, without an acknowledgement, you can't have this conversation. And that's where I said, you know what, we probably should. I had the bully pulpit. I understood that I was going to take a lot of flack for it. I knew people weren't going to stand up and say, oh, isn't this wonderful? The president of the IACP just said that there's been historic, mistreatment of African Americans and minorities historically. But I think that, and I've had this conversation when I've gone to the FBI National Academy, and I've said to people, you can't tell me how many people, show of hands in this room here, have ever sat in a patrol car and had somebody make inappropriate, racial comments, or, how many have sat there? Now, of course, nobody's going to raise their hands and admit to it. I have. I've sat in roll call and had people, make jokes that they probably shouldn't make. Did I stand up? Probably not as much as I should have, So I wasn't talking about contemporary issues in policing, but you know what? I think we all have to be held accountable for our own actions. And I think it's important for us as a profession to understand if we're going to move forward, then we've got to have this real awkward conversation. And my whole family are cops. I got two brothers that are cops. I got a sister that's a cop. My grandfather was a cop. I mean, I love this profession. It means the world to me. So I told people, I apologize if I offended anybody, never meant to do that. But I had to put into context why I said what I did and how I got there. So, sir, I appreciate your comments, but that's how I get there.
That's good.
Thank you.
And that's always the challenge of how do you contextualize this, right? How do you bottle that sort of timeline and thought process that went into what happened and what was said? And that's why we did these. It was not the first. That's not the first time that question's come up. And you were actually much more respectful than others. On some of the
You should have been in
listening
Texas
tours.
with us.
Yeah. So it was. That's why we did the listening tour. Precisely your question. We appreciate it because then you can get the additional context, and you start to sort of better understand why things happen the way they did, whether it's consensus use of force policy or the acknowledgement.
And you did work in a tough town in South Florida. Some of my Doral guys worked in the city of Miami before they came over. Another tough place. Hialeah. Other questions, other comments, please. Carlos, you're not getting a pay raise.
It's okay, Chief. Thank you. I appreciate it. Carlos Arango from the beautiful city of Doral, home of Chief DeLuca. So I have a question. I keep hearing this conversation about, going out and reaching across the street, and especially in all the tension that's been going on, and, whether it's white, black, white, Hispanic, whatever your opposing side might be. And I see that the IACP and law enforcement continuously goes to the middle of the street. We cross to 3/4 of the street. I mean, how do we motivate, or how do we get the opposing sides to come to the table? They always, everybody talks about having a conversation, but when we sit and want to have a conversation, very few people step up and have that conversation. And the second half of that is, I keep hearing about, oh, law enforcement does so much good and we keep getting criticized. How can the ICP help in promoting that positive side on law enforcement that nobody hears about? We tried it a couple years back with the Why I Wear the Badge campaign, which I think was excellent. It went great, but it was really, for the most part, an in-house pep rally where law enforcement looked at it and we all got motivated and all what great stories, but I never really saw that out there in the media. Everybody knows who the NRA is. Why doesn't everybody know who the IACP is? That's my comment.
I'll take the first one.
Please.
And then I'll defer the harder question to you guys.
Yeah, I'll give it to Gary. Yeah.
So when all this was transpiring, and again, being 124 years old, we have a lot of resources from past work, but also can marshal resources to address future work. So 2 years ago now, we stood up the Institute for Community Police Relations because of the fact that when you have, and I don't want to be so U.S.-centric, but when you have a president's task force on 21st century, regardless of who is going to be president, those presidential priorities tend to drift and tend to go to other places. So what we started working on at the ISP was, how do you institutionalize the stuff that you need without having the politics assigned to it? So when we started looking at the Institute for Community Police Relations and really building on work that we'd already done, but more importantly to focus on innovative stuff that we could do, we fell into a windfall. And I'm going to say, hey, I knew it was going to be invaluable, and I knew it was going to be important resources. But something that kickstarted us was Michael Jordan, the basketball player, out of nowhere, contributed $2 million of his own money to two groups. One was IACP's Institute for Community Police Relations. The other one was the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, who we have regular conversations with and have formed a good partnership with. But what that $1 million has enabled us to do, it's not about the money. It's not about the money. For us, it's been about testing innovative concepts that can help bring those groups together to the middle of the street. One of those pieces that we've done was partner with Howard University to stand up a class on inside out in policing, where it brought millennial African-American students from Howard into a classroom, along with police officers from surrounding jurisdictions, to have a 12-week journey, which you both have been at, to get a better understanding. But more importantly, how do you bottle that sort of transformational experience where the first day was awkward and not fun, to the last day that, there was a shared understanding and sort of that middle of the street, right? With the goal of us having that as a pilot to use in other jurisdictions where there's a historically black college or university. But more importantly, how do you take those lessons and share them broadly, the stuff that's working? How do you operationalize those pillars of the task force? Because there's good stuff in there. There's nothing new, but there's good stuff in the task force report. So the ICPR at IACP, we've tried to be that clearinghouse for existing stuff, but we've also tried to be an incubator for new and innovative things that we push out on a regular basis. So I hope that helps, but that's the piece that we're working hard on. And again, the Jordan money is helping enormously in helping us to test innovation. And the second question I'm going to defer to you guys.
So I'll take a bite at that. Well, the Why I Wear the Badge was a great campaign, and Carlos, I agree with you. It was a rah-rah for us internally, but I think we needed that to motivate ourselves to tell our story. And that's the challenge for every chief and every leader in this room is you have to tell the story. And the more good stories you have, it's going to take care of kind of the one-offs, because we take a step back when one thing happens. They forget about all those positive stories. But it's a challenge, and I think it's one that we can't give up on. We love what we do. We wouldn't be in this room, or we wouldn't be at this conference. I guess the encouragement is, how can you push harder on the flywheel? What is the next best idea to tell our story? Social media is the way we live. And also, on the other side, it's how we respond. Because we respond to things on social media that are half-truths, that are not, aired out. And I know how much time you spend, resolving some of these matters that is taken out of context. But I guess social media is the big thing. And is there one thing that's going to, help us get over it? I don't think so.
One of the things that the last 3 years crises has helped do, and again, the elected and appointed leadership has spent a lot of time on this, is IACP used to be really good at commenting when stuff was really great or when stuff was really bad. That in-between stuff, which is the majority of where you need to be, was not something that was pushed out regularly. So we've upped our game considerably in how we communicate and when we communicate and why we communicate. It's still never going to be enough to get to the contextual issues that we talked about. We'll never be able to bottle that story and share it broadly. But our job is to make sure that you have the information and cover at times that you need. We're still working on sort of that broad messaging piece. I know some of our committees have been toiling with sort of how do you do the Marines commercial for law enforcement, right? How do you build that esprit de corps across, in this case, the United States, when you don't have $10 million to spend. I mean, that's that challenge that we have ongoing.
Yeah, so last year, over the last 3 years, I think these high-profile use of force cases, we found ourselves in a perfect storm, because you got, from the Ferguson, all the way up till today with a number of high-profile use of force cases. Then you've got the use of the cell phone constantly, people videotaping that clip, and you've got the 24-hour news cycle. And it's a perfect storm right now to try and, it just hurts the police. We hear about it all the time from everybody. And as we traveled around last year, we heard people ask that question all the time: what can IACP do? Well, when you think about it, IACP, it's $150, membership dues. We don't have the deep pockets that the NRA has. If we did, we'd be doing that Marine Corps commercial. So what we try to tell people is, it really is at a local level. When you're out there every day, just like I know Don does in Doral and in his community, and I did in my community, and the folks on our board do, every day you're out there in the newspaper trying to tell that good story. Talk to the newspaper. Don't be afraid. Be accountable. Be transparent. IACP has put up, we've got, the dashboard that we have now on critical issues. So if you go to our IACP website, you're going to find a one-sheet on, say, use of force, or one sheet on asset forfeiture or pursuits. So if you're being asked questions about it, you have a use of force case, or you just want to go out and talk about it, you've got this. It's got all the messaging points on it for you, so that you, at a local level, it can go out and talk about it. Because even as Don is the president of IACP, if he wanted to come out, and first of all, we would never talk about a use of force case that happened in Miami, but if you wanted to go out and talk about it, they'd say, well, who are you? You're from Doral, Florida. You may be the president of IACP. It really is a local issue. And we tell the chiefs all the time, you got to get out there in your own media market, and you got to talk to them every day and try and be positive about it.
And there's a Global Perspective series on Monday that will have folks from the media on there to help with how that messaging should help, and how to interact with your media more closely.
And I think another opportunity is, we have the one big on Tuesday, 3 years after Ferguson, where I think the new chief is from Miami, Delrish Moss. We have Vanita Gupta. We have Jim Pascoe from the FOP. A very diverse panel. To hear their takes on things like that is important for us to hear. And what we'll take back from that, what did they do as far as the union? What did the chief do, or the new chief do, to kind of change the culture? These conversations help us go back and learn what we should be doing or might want to consider in the future. Yeah.
Other issues, questions, yes?
We'll get a microphone to you.
Good morning. I was just wanting to know about the One Mind campaign that you had going on for mental illness. I come from John Jay College. We do a lot of training with our NYPD folks and all the agencies, right? And of course, we're struggling a lot with this because we have a lot of people at Rikers who shouldn't be there because of the mental illness issues, but that's a bigger issue. But what I'd like to know is, how well is the One Mind campaign going? Are you going to use that data to shape some of the policies around mental illness training?
Well, the One Mind campaign was born out of something at the IACP, and I wish our first vice president was here. He's really the mind behind it. I think it is working. I know our agency has signed up, and I hope others in the room. Just a show of hands, any agencies here signed up for the One Mind campaign?
Yeah.
Great. Terry, do you want to go through the 4 steps? Because my memory is not as clear as most people, but I know there's 4 things we asked you to do. And just a shout out, big fan of Carol Mason. She's helping us on the hate crimes task force. She's been wonderful. Thank you. Let her know we said thank you.
So actually what happened was, how we started out with the One Mind campaign is we traveled around and we heard from folks, from our listening sessions, the number one issue was police officers dealing with folks inflicted with mental illness. So came back, talked to Lou Dekmar, who is now the first vice president, who was the second vice president at the time, asked him to head up the task force, formed a task force. They met at IACP headquarters. We brought in practitioners, we brought in police chiefs, we brought in everybody from that community and said, okay, what can we do to try and help the police departments who are trying to deal with this on a daily basis. I mean, Lou tells a story. He goes back and says, if you look historically, in 1960, there were 150 million people in this country, and there were 600,000 beds for people who were inflicted with mental illness. You fast forward to today, there's 320 million people in this country, and there's 60,000 beds for people inflicted with mental illness. So think about that. You think about those numbers. Where are those people? Those people are out there in the street, and they're the people that we're dealing with every day. And when you look at the numbers on use of force by police officers, probably 40% of those folks that we employ deadly force on are inflicted with mental illness as well. So these folks got together, they met, and they came up with recommendations. They said, look, again, to this gentleman's point, you're trying to be all things to all people. So what can IACP do? Well, it depends. If you're a large agency like a Seattle or LAPD or New Orleans, okay, you may be able to pour more resources into mental illness as compared to an agency that's only got 1 or 2 people in it. So can we put together kind of a cafeteria-style model for people to kind of say, here are the things that you should do, and here you could extend that and do more. So we came up with 4 issues, and this came from the practitioners in the field as well as the chiefs. The number 1 is make sure you've got a good policy on dealing with folks with mental illness, which I think everybody in the room probably does. Make sure you have a relationship with some type of a mental health care provider in your area. Number 3, you want to make sure that you've got 100% of your agency trained in mental health first aid. And then you need 20% of your agency that's going to be trained in CIT training as well. And again, that's kind of like the floor for everybody, and you can build on that. You can get 100% of your agency trained in CIT if you want to, but those are the 4 components of it. We're starting to really try and ramp it up and push it out and get more people. I know that for all the people we have signed up, I'm from Massachusetts. I got some other Mass folks here in the room. Massachusetts has 100 of their agencies out of above roughly 300 agencies in Massachusetts that are signed up and made that pledge for the One Mind campaign. So it's certainly on our priority list. You hit the nail on the head when you talk about the 3 biggest healthcare or mental health providers in the country. Number 1 is Rikers Island. Number 2 is the Cook County Jail, and number 3 is the LA County Jail. It shouldn't be like that. We have absolutely criminalized mental illness, which it shouldn't be. So, but it's all been laid at the feet of the police, and you don't know what to do with it, to be quite honest.
We had the opportunity early this year I did, speak before the United States Senate Appropriations on mental illness and what the policing needs, and talk about the One Mind campaign and what's out there. And hopefully we'll be able to get funding for some of the agencies that don't have the opportunity to push out these types of programs.
Oh, is the One Mind.
Here's the guy who knows more about mental illness than all of us.
I just used all your statistics, Lou, so don't go at it, all right?
Very nice gentleman to be here. I'm Randy Nelson, Thornton, Colorado. Police Department, just 20 minutes north of Denver, about 140,000 population, department size 300. The biggest problem, I'd like just to add to the lady's comment on mental health, that's my biggest serious issue from our law enforcement agency. It's the mental health issues and crises we're responding to are just continuing to increase. The One Mind campaign really is not really helping, to be quite honestly with you. My issue is early intervention. I'm not as worried about the people already in the jail facility as trying to get them from not going in the jail facility. For my size agency, we are experiencing 60 a month mental health holds. We're already approaching 700 by the end of the year. It's not stopping. And so I would certainly encourage IACP to continue to develop any type of training, continually to look into this issue. It seems to me that we still are looking at this as a silo process. Mm-hmm. We got dispatch we need to bring into in their CIT training. We've got social services needs to come in. We seem to look at it from a law enforcement perspective, and I think more of a collaborative effort with IACP bringing all these people in be really critically important. I would hope this process doesn't stop. Sometimes large organizations, this is the theme of the year and they go on to another theme. This is going to be with us ongoingly. And the problem I'm having is there doesn't seem to be a nexus to what's happening. So if you're talking about Narcan, that's related to mental illness. If you're talking about opiates, that's related to mental illness, domestic violence. Everything that's coming with this. And I don't think we really have explored this issue a lot. Getting people trained, I have 130 officers CIT trained. I have my dispatch trained. But the problem is not going down. From the state of Colorado, it certainly may be related to the THC, the drugs. However, you can't prove it. You made a comment earlier, the politicians, they don't really give a damn what law enforcement says out there. Quite honestly with you, it's a political agenda in many cases. But I can't stand before a city council and say, is the increase to mental illness specifically related to drugs? Can't do it. I can't find the nexus. It's a whole variety of related issues. And so if you look at my liabilities, I'm already in federal court on one shooting. This is going to continue. And so if there's a way that we can really focus on early intervention and get our hands on this thing, because these problems are dovetailing right into the school systems. What's the generational aspect of this mental illness? We don't have an idea on this thing at all. And I think we're siloed, and I think we're too quick to say, well, this program really works, look how it's going down. I don't buy on that. I need to find measurable results. And that means to me less officers going to this, my costs going down. I'm already spending over $300,000 a year to respond to these type of calls. And so our outcome measurements are really poor. They're just really, really poor. And I think there's this greater effort that collectively with IACP, we can really put our thoughts together and bring a whole collaborative effort at a greater level than we're doing today. And that's just my comments, and I really appreciate the listening tour and any effort we can continue on that work. Very much appreciate it.
I appreciate your comments, and before I let Lou speak on this, you know, we've made it from the moment Attorney General Sessions was thought about being selected, Vince and I went and talked to him. One of the big issues we talked about is how we become the de facto social services, and we can't do it. It's eaten up so much of our man hours, personnel hours, time off the street. And we talked about CIT. I hear your frustration, and I'm going to ask Lou to speak. Same thing when I testified before the Senate, made it really clear. CIT is not the answer. It's not the answer. You got to work with the attorneys, you got to work with healthcare, but they've got to come with us. And I don't know what's going to make that happen, but Lou, maybe you can help out a little, give some guidance.
Yeah, I guess the concern I would have is, you know, if anybody was under the impression that the One Mind campaign is a treatment program, and that as a result of the One Mind campaign, you're going to have a reduction in calls. The One Mind campaign is an opportunity for de-escalation and identification of individuals that suffer from mental illness so that that individual survives that police response. That's the purpose. It's not a treatment. Your frustration, though, is felt not only in this country, but throughout the world. I just left the international or the World Chairs meeting. They're talking about the same thing I heard you talking about. And as the president indicated, de facto, social problems have become police problems. We've criminalized mental illness. The Los Angeles County Jail, or excuse me, the Los Angeles County Sheriff, who runs their jail, is on our board, and yesterday told me of his 17,000 inmates, 5,000 are on mental health treatment protocols. So we're not gonna have the answer for treatment, but I think what we miss is we miss the opportunity for the bully pulpit. We miss the opportunity to call community partners together. And I can tell you in our community, we recognize that, and so we appeal to the faith community. And as a consequence, we got a mental health court. We identified 25 individuals responsible for 200 arrests 3 years ago. Since that program began, we've had 3 arrested. And so what I would suggest is first understand what the One Mind campaign is and isn't, and the other is understand that we've got to provide the leadership because nobody else is gonna. And you hit the nail on the head. The politicians, there's not a big constituency for this. So consequently, we've got to be that voice. And I think in many jurisdictions, we've missed that opportunity. You know, I'll be happy to discuss anything about the One Mind campaign. I can tell you, if all your folks are CIT trained, as mine are, you know a peripheral benefit of that, at least in the agencies I'm familiar with, is you've seen also a reduction in use of force. Georgia has got 1/3 of its police officers, 35,000, 1/3 trained. And we've seen our fatal police shootings. Georgia's 8th in population, our fatal police shootings were 42nd. And I attribute that to CIT. The ability to de-escalate those situations in a way that not only deal with the mentally ill, but those that are agitated, those that are emotionally disturbed, those that are on substance abuse. So the One Mind campaign captures aspects of those tools and provides the officers the resources to survive that encounter and that citizen to survive the encounter. But it was never intended to be a treatment, and it certainly is not going to reduce recidivism. If you take them to the hospital, they spin them around 3 times and send them back out the door.
Thank you, Lou.
Excellent.
So,
Vince.
and the macro answer to that question also is IACP puts out a legislative agenda each year. The number one priority that is and remains the primary legislative priority is the Criminal Justice Commission, to take a much broader look. The last one was completed in 67, 65. And so taking a broader look at the entire criminal justice system and those intersections with important pieces like where the public health, public safety intersection is. It was also the number one overarching priority mentioned in the task force report, but never talked about. And so for us, the macro piece is having a broader look at all of the pieces that are touching law enforcement. There was a great deal of important work that came out of that report from the 60s.
And just one other thing, we've had 3 separate meetings with SAMHSA. They get, I think, a bucket of money of about $14 million to train primarily caregivers and social workers. We're appealing to them to give us $1 million of that so that we can also put that into training. And so far it's been favorably received, and I'm hopeful that we'll see that hopefully in the next fiscal year. So thank you, sir, for your sharing that concern.
Anyone else? Any more questions, comments? Sir?
You know, when my name is Dennis Butler. I'm the police chief in Ottawa, Kansas, and I retired from Alexandria, Virginia in 2004. You know, we started out talking about use of force, then we started talking about racial profiling, all of those things I think we could be here till about
Tomorrow.
4 o'clock to talk about. And I had thoughts about each one of them, but Lou just said something that I was going to say, and I'd just like to elaborate on that a little bit. And that is, I became a police chief 13 years ago, so I've been in law enforcement for 38 years now. And I will tell you, this job has been the hardest job I've ever had. And I went to a much smaller department of 29 officers, leaving one of 340. I thought, how hard can this be? I think most police chiefs have probably said that. But what I learned, and this is what I wanted to share, there was more specifics, but I think an overall theme is that personal engagement by the police chief, personal time and effort, and is not something you can delegate all the time, especially when it comes to what we like to call community policing. Community policing looks a lot of different ways, and it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. Changing the culture of a 29-officer police department, I thought would take a couple of years. And, you know, sometimes I see chiefs come and go in 2 and 3 years, and I'm thinking, how did they change anything? Because it took me a good, probably 8 or 9 years, maybe I was a slow learner. I came from an accredited department. We eventually got our department accredited. It's only the 7th one out of almost 400 in the state of Kansas, and you know the stats on the national rate. But my point is really to echo what Lou said, because that was what I was going to say, is whether it's CIT, whether it's domestic violence, batterers intervention programs, sexual assault kit initiative, if you're not personally engaged in that, not just delegating that, I don't believe you can be effective or as effective as you otherwise would be. This is a hard job. You can't mail it in, and you've got to step up to help make that difference. And so here's my request of you. In Kansas, especially in the western part of the state where it's more rural, there's not a huge buy-in to the IACP, and a lot of it has to do with the official position on guns, especially out west. When I went to Kansas, I thought, coming from Virginia, right outside of D.C., I saw guns every time I turned around. It startled me at first. I always saw guns. Yet I will tell you, gun violence in Kansas is not anywhere near the rate it is in some urban places. So the people and law enforcement out there especially, it's a tool. It's a tool that citizens use. It's a tool that they use. They don't look at a gun and relay it directly to violence. So what you're doing here today, if you could take that on the road with people like you and go to places like Kansas and have this roundtable, this question and answer, I think the kinds of discussions you would have, especially explaining some of the policy and resolution positions, would go a long way in trying to increase the membership of the IACP, but also educate the public about what the IACP is about and what they're trying to do. That's not much in terms of specifics, but I think hopefully you get my drift on that.
Very valuable.
Thank you for doing this. I found this very helpful today.
Great.
Thank you, Chief.
Chief, would you help host and convene if we come to Kansas?
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Very good. We'll take you up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Getting down to the last 10 minutes or so.
Want to wrap it up?
Okay. Well, oh, there we go. Great.
Hi, I'm Mandy Nice, and I work in wellness program management and law enforcement. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate everything that you're doing with the IACP, especially in terms of the officer safety and wellness section. I was curious, when you first spoke, you said that you might expand some resources in terms of human resources and wellness. So I wanted to ask if you had some thoughts on that, if that's been something that's been coming up at the listening meetings, or if you had some options to expand that.
Want to talk about your show? So clearly one of the priorities for IACP has been officer safety and wellness. One of the things that we've been talking about internally at IACP, we haven't announced it yet, we're actually thinking about holding just a separate conference just on officer safety and wellness, particularly when it comes to the resiliency piece. Last year when I traveled around, whether I speaking to the media, whether I was speaking to police chiefs or police officers, when you have these high-profile use of force cases, you can't expect officers to make real good decisions if they're not healthy themselves. And when you look at that cumulative effect of stress and trauma going from call to call to call, people don't even realize it. They don't talk about it. You may be coming from a fatal car accident, going to a fatal overdose call, then you have to go to a choking baby call, and the next thing you know, you're at a call where you might have to use deadly force. And you've got all those things going on in your mind. You've got that cumulative effect. Who talks about that? Well, during one of our listening tours, we were actually out in Seattle with Kathy O'Toole. And somebody raised the point about that, the cumulative effect of stress and trauma on officers. And Kathy says, well, actually, we have a program here in Seattle where we track every call that an officer goes on real time. So they actually have a numeric value that they put on that call. They said, okay, if it's a fatal car accident, that could be an 8. If it was an overdose, that might be a 6. And when that officer reaches that magic number, they actually bring the officer in off the street and say, hey, how you doing? What's going on? We do a great job if there's some real critical incident to bring them in and debrief the officer, and say, hey, it was an officer-involved shooting. We bring them in and we debrief them. But we don't think about that cumulative effect of stress and trauma. So we've talked a lot about it internally. I know that when I mentioned that the HR component, that's something that we're really looking at because I think that would be important. Those 35 committees that we have out there right now, we've got about 1,100 people involved in the 35 committees. That's another place where we really get our policy positions from, resolutions and the committees. And I think to have a committee, that's really just focused on HR-related and with the officer safety and wellness, because we've got a whole separate division just on officer safety and wellness. It's a priority for us. I know during Yost Zachary's year as president, his whole presidency was about police suicides. and reduction of police suicides. And we haven't seen a reduction, we've seen an increase in the number of police suicides as we've seen, you know, all the external issues that the police officers have been dealing with. So appreciate it. Do you want to add on that at all, Vincent?
No, and that's one of those pieces where if you see a gap in something that we should be doing, chances are it's happening in 2 or 3 places, but if it really needs a concentration like a section or you know, a task force, just raise it up, and that's the role that the IASP can play to help fill that gap.
Anyone else? If not, I just would like to tell you today at 3:30 is our opening ceremony. If any of you saw Simon Sinek last year, he talked about why. This year he's going to talk about winning. What is winning in police work? And it's not about how many arrests you make, how many calls you take. And I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation with a Q&A at the end. So with that, we'll close now, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.